My parents, a sunset. My child, a sunrise. I sit here between with a view.
Damn! I thought that was pretty profound.
Thank you.
So, not long ago, a friend of mine sent me this clip from an episode of Dropout's Game Changer, wherein cast members Zac Oyama, Lisa Gilroy, and Ally Beardsley all had to
Write a breathtaking poem.
I'm sort of a casual Dropout enjoyer. I've seen some episodes of their various shows and plenty of clips, of course. I don't know much about the cast, but I've never disliked anything I've seen from them. Until I saw this clip. Just kidding. I thought this had as much charm as any other clip I've seen. And with that in mind, I want to make it clear what the goal of this video is. This is not to say Zac, Ally, or Lisa is a terrible poet. Obviously not. They wrote these poems basically off the dome, probably in no more than a few minutes, if that. What's more, none of them are exactly poets or spoken word performers by trade, even if they are great writers, comedians, and improvisational actors. So the point of this video is not to say, wow, these guys suck at writing poetry. No, obviously that would be really unfair. That wasn't actually the point of the Game Changer round. So the point of this video is just to have some fun and maybe talk about what does and doesn't make short poetry effective. So let's jump right into it, starting with Zac's piece. Zac's piece kind of sounds like Zaxby's. Little auditory pun for you there.
My poem is called This Old Dog. This old dog sits on the sunny porch, waiting for his best friend. In time, he'll see him again and smile, and finally cross on to the next world.
Okay, just a couple more quick notes before we actually get into the text. First, these are technically spoken word poems as they were meant to be performed aloud rather than read on the page. Even so, for the purposes of this video, I will show the text on screen for analysis's sake. There's a conversation to be had about the differences in approach and execution between spoken word poems and page poems, but that's a topic for an entire video unto itself. As for how I've chosen to show the poems on the page, I'm pretty much relying on the captions and the performer's pauses for the punctuation and line breaks. You can say that's not right, and I know that line breaks do not intrinsically nor necessarily denote a pause. They serve multiple functions, and it depends who you ask, but we're getting too far into the weeds here. Point is, here is Zac's poem as presented on the page, at least according to me. So, for a poem written in just a few minutes, if that, this isn't half bad. I think the poem presents a decent twist toward the end. The first two lines simply make it sound like the dog is waiting for someone, perhaps his owner, to come home from work. The next two lines present a bit of a wrinkle with the phrase "in time" being so vague, and the last two lines present the twist. That one of the parties in this poem is likely dead. I believe that's what we're meant to interpret by cross on and next world. I rather like a lot of the vagueness here. In a short poem, there's not as much time for context or clarification as in a longer poem, so I think some level of vagueness is permissible. That's certainly true for a lot of haikus that you read, and put a pin in that. We're going to talk about haikus more later. My favorite bit of uncertainty comes from the fourth line here. He'll see him again and smile. As it stands, I'm not sure which he is which. Is it the owner or the dog who will smile? And keep in mind, we don't even know for sure that the best friend is the owner, but it seems like a fair assumption, no? But because we don't know who is who, we don't know whether the dog is already dead or whether it's the best friend, and we don't know who will do the crossing on. The poem at first makes it sound like the dog is still alive and who will be the one crossing on, but I'm not so sure. Could it be that the sunny porch is the dog's own heaven, or perhaps the dog's interpretation of heaven? I like that the ending reframes the beginning in so many ways. This, I think, is kind of the ideal when it comes to short poetry, and all poetry for that matter. There is more being said than what's actually on the page, whether the author intended it or not. In Cole Rudy's video on short poems, he says this when discussing Wolves by Douglas Kearney.
This does everything I think a great short poem should do. It gives you just enough to make an impact and leave you satisfied, but it also leaves you with something to chew on after.
I recently showed this poem in a video, one of Basho's haikus. It reads, "In Kyoto, hearing the cuckoo, I long for Kyoto." In showing this poem, I discussed the multiple interpretations to be had with the seemingly contradicting nature of the first and third line, and how the second line interspersed there adds to that interesting duality between being somewhere and longing for it at the same time. Now, with all of that in mind, this isn't a flawless poem by any means. I'm not sure if any poem can be truly flawless, but you know what I mean. When you write short poetry, and really when you write poetry in general, one of the most important things is economy. If you set out to write a short poem, like a haiku for example, you really have to ask yourself if every sentence, line, phrase, and word needs to be there, if every word is truly pulling its weight. I'm not sure that the last line here, "to the next world," really adds much more to the poem than what the line before already implied. And I must say, I kind of like cross on for its preposition. Cross over is usually the phrase we would use. Cross on certainly is still acceptable, and I think even that one little change in preposition has something to suggest about the nature of death, even more so when we remove the last line, which honestly reads a bit as a cliché. Of course, maybe I'm reading too much into things here. As always, let me know. As for some other flaws, I think the words old and sunny are kind of boring descriptors. The term best friend is also kind of basic, although for some, the poem's simplicity might be part of its overwhelming strength, especially with the recontextualization we see at the end. It actually kind of reminds me of this poem, which you're probably familiar with, The Two-Headed Calf by Laura Gilpin. Tomorrow, when the farm boys find this freak of nature, they will wrap his body in newspaper and carry him to the museum. But tonight, he is alive, and in the north field with his mother. It is a perfect summer evening, the moon rising over the orchard, the wind in the grass, and as he stares into the sky, there are twice as many stars as usual. I'd love to talk about this poem again under different circumstances in a different video, but for this video I'll just point out that simplicity. The phrases perfect summer evening and wind in the grass are kind of excruciatingly simple or otherwise cliché, and yet the poem stands really well in spite of them, or maybe even because of them. When it comes to perfect summer evening, I feel like that one really lands because it gives us a sense that there is no better way to describe this evening than with the word perfect. It truly is perfect. What's more, the language of the poem doesn't detract from its ultimate point. The poem is, of course, about the two-headed calf, and the fact that nature doesn't discriminate the way humans do. The phrase freak of nature is another cliché, and yet it's an accurate thing the farm boys would say. And since that first stanza almost kind of takes place from the farm boys' perspective, it's apt. But as for nature, it's perfect, in fact better than perfect, with twice as many stars as usual for this little child. If you're watching this video, odds are good you're a writer yourself. And if you're a longtime viewer of mine, odds are also good that you can't stand AI. If you're anything like me, you've got to hate the AI tools and assistants shoved into writing software. And chances are, even if there's no visible AI, your word processor is probably scraping your writing to train AI. If you're as fed up as I am, you should use the sponsor of today's video, Ellipsis, which you can start using today for free. Ellipsis is an LGBTQ+ founded company made by writers for writers. Ellipsis genuinely cares about your privacy. They will not sell your data, nor will they use your writing to train any LLM. What's more, Ellipsis is all about the spirit of collaboration, an absolutely necessary factor in today's writing landscape, in my opinion. Ellipsis has a monthly newsletter, human-made templates to feed your creativity, and a Discord server where you can find an accountability partner. And once you have that partner, Ellipsis makes it easier than ever to comment and collaborate on each other's work. You can find my link in the description and pinned comment, ellipsis.app/rd, or you can use this QR code on screen to start using Ellipsis today, as I said, completely for free. Thanks so much to Ellipsis for sponsoring this video. But we've gotten rather sidetracked. Let's move on to Lisa's poem. Lisa's is the longest of the bunch, though still relatively short.
This poem is called Exhale. We share a cigarette outside your mother's house. White clouds of smoke meet the white clouds of winter air. I can't tell which are which. I only know I'm happy to share it, this air between us. I'm only pretending to inhale. I don't know why. But you, I am inhaling, deeply and completely, these white clouds of air between us, never wanting to exhale.
Whoa!
Okay, there are some intriguing features here. I think the second line, outside your mother's house, presents some interesting context. I think it's safe to assume the speaker and subject in this poem are lovers, right? And so it's interesting to wonder what they're doing outside the subject's mother's house. What's more, Lisa is going for more imagery than Zac, and I can appreciate that attempt. And as for the ending, I certainly don't hate it. I think it was a decent little spin on the operative verbs in the poem, inhale and exhale. However, I think this is probably my least favorite of the bunch. Even though I liked Gilroy's performance, I kind of immediately rolled my eyes at her first line. Cigarettes and smoke are such tired cliches in poetry at this point. Halsey even had a poem in their collection that pointed this out directly. On a Reddit post about Ally's poem specifically, one commenter wrote, "Lisa's sounded like straight from a coffee shop's first-year student college slam night in that it came off as the least sincere to me, because it felt directly from that place, and presumably she isn't just starting off college, but it was a great rendition of that space. Like, just about every cliche you could pull from was dead on. I used to teach slam to students, and it felt almost line for line." And hey, for all we know, maybe Lisa was intentionally leaning into cliches as a comedian. Just look at how Zac tries to hold back laughter when Lisa starts her poem. It also reminds me of this tweet. White people try to write poetry like, "My pale hands, on her pale skin, we shattered, cigarettes." And funnily enough, I actually might like this parody poem better than Lisa's, but we can talk more about that in a minute. I promise I'm not trying to be mean here, but Lisa's poem reminds me a lot of Insta poetry. It's a piece that seems to employ the common tropes of poetry, but with little consideration as to what those tropes are doing and why. And again, that's fine. She wrote this under an intense time crunch, but let me explain what I mean. Beyond the cliched subject matter, there's the aforementioned attempt at imagery. Notice how the speaker says, "White clouds of smoke meet the white clouds of winter air. I can't tell which are which." You can't? Exactly what kind of cigarette are you smoking? Again, it reminds me of bad Insta poetry because it's something that kind of sounds poetic on the surface, but logistically and logically doesn't really hold up to scrutiny. At the same time, it comes off as too literal to read as figurative language. What's more, I actually think this poem is a little too long, which might sound funny given how short it is, but it's like I was saying with Zac's poem and Economy of Form. Is every word really pulling its weight in this poem, or are a lot of these lines and phrases kind of unnecessarily re-emphasizing what's already clear? That's why I said the parody poem was honestly better. It achieves its goal as a parody in the most economical way possible, and on the poetic level, the line break after shattered and before cigarettes creates kind of a fun double meaning. Did the speaker and subject shatter and then there were cigarettes, or did they shatter cigarettes? If so, what does that even mean? It becomes kind of fun to think about. And like I said, Lisa's ending isn't terrible. It creates the question, what does it mean to inhale someone? What does it mean to inhale a lover? The phrase, "I'm only pretending to inhale," also creates a slight bit of intrigue. But like I'm trying to say, I think those drips of meaning could have been streamlined. I know this poem is obviously a rough draft, and there probably won't be a redraft, but if I were to suggest changes to this poem, I'd point back to the piece I really liked, the second line. I think the author of this poem could build on the setting. What are they doing here? Why? What does this setting and situation add to this moment and the sharing of the cigarette? I've said many times before that it's in the specific details where a poem can really flourish. That might not be true for all poems, but I think it absolutely would add a lot here. What makes this moment between these two lovers special compared to the many other millions of poems about two lovers? My friend Jacob Kramer recently self-published a little collection called A Swish on the Shrine Steps, which features a lot of interesting shorter pieces. This one is called Nude. I don't mind being naked around you that much. It feels like I confess a great crime, and the priest kisses me. Now, in all fairness, speaking of economy of form, I personally don't think the words "that much" add a lot to this poem. But otherwise, I think this is a pretty effective piece. The piece rests on the simile, of course, and in a certain way, I think there's a double meaning to it. The kiss from the priest might be seen as sinister, given the many sexual abuse scandals priests have incurred over the years, and in that case, the words "that much" might be fair, as they suggest uncertainty or self-delusion. But truthfully, I think the speaker of this poem is being very sincere. I think they're saying they feel as comfortable with this partner as they would to have the forgiveness of God, and that's a pretty powerful sentiment for a poem to communicate, especially a shorter work. And that'll take us into Ally's poem, the shortest of the bunch, and the only one without a title.
My parents, a sunset. My child, a sunrise. I sit here between with a view.
Damn!
I will give props to Ally for really leaning into the economy of form. It feels like they challenged themselves to make the poem as short as possible while still maintaining cohesion and a message. Moreover, kind of like the Basho haiku from earlier, I feel like there are sort of two ways to interpret the speaker's positioning. When they say they're between a sunset and a sunrise, I find that interesting. At first, I interpret that literally. They sit, and on their left is a sunset, and on their right is a sunrise. There are literally two suns, each half covered by the horizon. And I think that's an interesting duality. When the sun is halfway above the horizon, you really can't tell whether it's rising or setting, can you? Okay, I looked it up, and that's not entirely true. The colors and atmosphere between a sunrise and sunset are apparently different. Of course, there is another way to interpret sitting between a sunrise and sunset, and that would simply be sitting with the sun at midday, no? And in that sense, the movement of the sun in this poem is just explicitly representative of a person's stage of life. When we're born, we're a sunrise. When we get older, we're a sunset. When we're in between, we're sun at midday. And I suppose that's really the poem's only problem, the fact that this metaphor has been done before quite a bit, I would argue. There's even the Sphinx's riddle, what walks on 4 legs in the morning, 2 in the afternoon, and 3 in the evening. And sure, that doesn't mention the sun explicitly, but it's still striking at the same idea, that there's an artistic linkage between the timeline of our lives and the timeline of a day. Also, I might again argue that the last line of this poem isn't entirely necessary. I feel like I sit here between sort of says it all, with the last line kind of implied already. Again, feel free to disagree with me on that one. According to that Reddit post I mentioned earlier about this poem, the piece is apparently all the more profound based on Ally's life circumstances. I don't know their circumstances, and as I've said before on this channel, I don't think outside context should always be strictly necessary to enjoy a poem. In fact, I would argue poems should be able to stand on their own. I've mentioned haiku a few times now in this video. As far as poetry goes, it's probably about as economical as it gets, at least when it comes to a specific form. I've talked about this before, but haikus in the modern Western tradition actually don't follow the 5-7-5 rule. That's sort of a westernization of what the Japanese do with mora, which are distinct from syllables. These days, the only constraints on a Western haiku would be their brevity, the need for a seasonal reference, and the need for a kireji, or a cutting word. As Wikipedia explains, people deliberate and disagree on the true function of a kireji, and it can be hard to define, but most people would agree that it's a word that adds a new layer to the poem, cutting it as it were, sometimes literally dividing the poem into two halves. But oftentimes the kireji comes at the very end of the poem. Wendy Cope's poem Haiku reads, "A perfect white wine is sharp, sweet, and cold as this, bird song in winter." Now, like a lot of Cope's poems, this is a little bit silly, and I honestly don't love it, but it does technically showcase the rules. Short, a seasonal reference, and a cutting word. What word is the cutting word? Up for debate, but I would say it's birdsong, as it's an unexpected volta that transitions us from one layer of the poem to the next. Even so, a lot of haikus won't employ a seasonal reference. For example, Malu Cycles by Maxine Hong Kingston. I pay. In Dream, Susie's medical bill. For real, Moana Bartab. The dialect employed here really adds a lot of unspoken context to the poem itself. Like all great short poems, it's suggesting even more than what it says, and it does so through the way it says it, and not through the content itself. But while lots of haikus drop the seasonal reference, there's often still some kind of reference to nature. For example, in E. Ethelbert Miller's The King's Haiku, Martin Luther King, dancing on his mountaintop, love raining on earth. Notice that this poem, like Cope's, actually does follow the 5-7-5 structure. It's always fun when you find words or phrases that are 5 or 7 syllables and you can work them into a haiku. Or, in this instance, Martin Luther King's name. And similar to both Zac's and Ally's poems, this piece seems to employ ordinary earthly imagery to imply something about the afterlife. I also mentioned that haikus tend to have a volta, shift, or cutting word. I would say surprise is an effective element to employ when you have so few words. This haiku by Busan is one that stuck with me over these last few months. A high priest empties his bowels in the withered fields. Each word in this haiku offers a new surprise, but sometimes the best surprises are those that are a little more subtle and a little less shocking. For example, this piece by Hayan Charara, Old Couple. Whoever wakes first checks to see if the other made it through the night. You might have guessed where that was going by the second line, and yet it still feels impactful. It presents an angle and perspective on what it's like to be an old couple, a perspective that you might not have thought about before. All of this actually reminds me of this Emily Dickinson poem. Tell all the truth but tell it slant, success in circuit lies. Too bright for our infirm delight, the truth's superb surprise. As lightning to the children eased with explanation kind, the truth must dazzle gradually, or every man be blind. Yes, a short poem ought to dazzle gradually. It doesn't have to have a twist necessarily, but it needs to offer more as it goes on. This was one of my problems with Lisa's poem. I felt like a lot of its substance was unnecessarily repeated and harped on, offering all the same instead of offering more. But I do think all of the Dropout poets here employed an element of surprise in their poems at least decently well, and frankly, knowing that they only had like a minute to write these, honestly quite shocking how well they did. So, what did we learn from all of this? I don't know, man. I'm just trying to have a good time, and I hope you had a good time too. What do you think? Did you enjoy these poems? Did you interpret any of them differently than I did? What do you think makes a good short poem and a good poem in general? Please tell me everything. And hey, before you go, take a look at this poem. This is a piece from one of my patrons, Clara Rivoli. Kovu. 2,000 years ago, before there was chocolate or D&D, before the library went up in flames, when you couldn't yet get a replacement knee, a cat stepped on a wet piece of clay. A man then laughed and baked the clay with the paw print and used it to build the road that leads to Rome. A man who told us, even accidentally, the cat I love guides my way home. A cat. My cat. So we know felines remain the same, and the same are the people who love them, who feed them and pet them, who revel in their mayhem, who remembered them. Something tells me such a cat was happy, if something of it managed to survive. If it managed to yell through the ages, I was here, I mattered, I thrive, if someone kept it alive. A cat lived, millennia between us, but it did, and it breathed the same air you breathe. Isn't that all you truly need? Remember me, remember me. I wonder if the man knew in 2,000 years they would pull the paw from the ground and know a naughty cat tried to ruin the work, but just turned it into pure gold to be found. If he knew just looking at the piece, I would cry. And it would make me wish I had my very own piece, and in it I would mark my own cat's paw, and I'd die in peace, knowing I had buried it deep in my backyard. And 2,000 years from now, when they found it hidden there, they wouldn't know his name started with a K, or which was his favorite nap chair. But they would know one thing. Kovu was loved. What could be greater than that? He was loved. For the chance to submit your work at the end of my videos, or if you just like what I do here and want to support, you can donate to the Patreon too. For just $3 a month, you can see videos early, hear about what I'm reading each month, and join the community Discord. The Discord is a lot of fun. We do prompts submitted by patrons twice a month, and we get together for an open mic and voice chat every other Saturday. You're seeing my patrons' names on screen right now, and as always, I want to truly thank them for their support. If you want to support me in other ways, all the algorithm stuff really helps. Liking, commenting, subscribing, hyping, shattering cigarettes, etc. You can also follow me on my socials if you want, but no matter what, keep reading, keep writing, and ultimately, keep in mind, this is a rough draft. And for sticking around this long, here's a writing prompt for you. Your prompt is simple today. Set a timer for 60 seconds and write as much as you can. There should never be a moment where you're not writing. If you can't think of what to write, you have to write filler words. Once the 60 seconds are up, read what you've written and sit with it for a minute. Then, feel free to edit it down however you like. But I want you to try to keep it short. See if you can come out of this exercise with a brief poem that says more by saying less. It's your turn now. Get to writing.